There was a time when she explained every decision she made, and then quietly she stopped, not because she was angry, not because she didn't care, but because she finally understood that peace does not require permission. For most of her life, she believed that being considerate meant being clear. Clear meant explaining. Explaining meant justifying. And justifying, she thought, was the price of being understood. She learned this early. Long before anyone told her directly, it was in the pauses people took after she spoke, in the raised eyebrows, in the gentle questions that sounded polite but felt heavy. Why this choice? Why now? Why not something easier? So she explained. She explained her schedule, she explained her boundaries, she explained why she needed time alone, why she declined invitations, why she chose differently than expected. She explained until her explanations became habits, automatic. Unquestioned, at first it felt responsible, mature, even kind. But responsibility, when stretched too far, becomes weight. She didn't notice the weight immediately. No one does. Weight accumulates quietly, in the body, in the mind. In the pauses between decisions. She noticed it one evening, sitting alone, replaying a conversation that had already ended. She was preparing a response to a question no one had asked yet. That's when it struck her. She was still explaining. Even in silence, the realization unsettled her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. She had spent years making her life easier for others to understand, at the cost of making it harder for herself to live. There had been love in her life, and work, and responsibility, but there had also been a quiet habit of shrinking her certainty so it could fit inside someone else's comfort. She wasn't unhappy, but she wasn't fully at ease either. Ease is not loud, it doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives when something unnecessary leaves. What left her life was not people, it was permission seeking. The first time she didn't explain herself, it wasn't intentional. Someone invited her to something she didn't want to attend. Nothing wrong with it, nothing urgent. She looked at the message. She typed a response, then erased it. She typed again, then paused, and finally she sent a simple answer. No reasons. No softening, no apology. Her hand lingered on the phone longer than it needed to. She waited. Nothing happened. No follow-up question. No disappointment expressed aloud. No tension. The world continued. That moment stayed with her longer than she expected, not because of relief, but because of surprise. She had always believed that explanations were necessary to prevent conflict, but there had been no conflict. That's when she began to question something she had never questioned before: how much of her explaining had been necessary, and how much had been fear. Fear wears many disguises. It calls itself politeness. It calls itself empathy. It calls itself being considerate, but fear is still fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of being alone in a decision. She realized she had been managing reactions more than making choices. That realization did not make her angry. It made her tired, tired in a way that rest doesn't fix. As she grew older, time began to feel different, not shorter, more valuable. She became aware of how much energy she spent explaining what felt obvious to her, why she needed quiet evenings, why she valued predictability, why she preferred depth over variety. These were not new preferences. They had always been there, she had just been translating them constantly for others. Translation is exhausting. She started noticing the pattern everywhere, at work, in friendships, in family conversations. Before any decision, her mind would already be preparing justification. If I do this, I should explain why. If I don't do that, I should clarify my reasons. Her inner life had become a courtroom, every choice on trial, every preference requiring defense. She didn't want that anymore, not rebellion, not defiance, just rest. So she began to experiment, small choices, low stakes. She declined things without elaboration. She chose silence instead of clarification. She let pauses exist without filling them. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Silence always does when you've spent years filling it. She worried she might appear distant, or rude, or uninterested. But something unexpected happened. People adjusted. Some didn't ask follow-up questions. Some accepted her answers as complete. Some simply moved on. And those who pushed for explanations revealed something important. They weren't asking to understand her. They were asking to feel comfortable. Comfort, she realized, is not her responsibility. This understanding didn't come with confidence at first. It came with clarity. Clarity is quieter than confidence. But stronger, she wasn't becoming less kind. She was becoming more honest. Honesty does not require detail. It requires alignment. As days passed, her life didn't become smaller. It became simpler. She noticed how much time she gained when she stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. She slept better, not because problems disappeared, but because she wasn't carrying imaginary ones. Her decisions began to feel cleaner. Yes felt intentional, no felt complete. She didn't need approval to feel settled anymore. That shift didn't isolate her. It refined her relationships. Those who respected her limits remained. Those who needed constant access drifted. Drifting was not loss, it was alignment. She learned something crucial. People who value you do not require explanations for your boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, they are signals. Signals that say, this is where I end. This is where I begin. She had spent years softening those signals. Now she let them stand, not loudly, not aggressively, simply, this wasn't a transformation others could see easily. There were no announcements, no declarations. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. She no longer measured herself by how well she was understood. She measured herself by how honest she was being with her time. Time had become precious, not because she had less of it, but because she finally knew its value. She didn't explain herself anymore, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned the difference between communication and justification. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a different pace, a pace where choices were made quietly, where peace came before persuasion, where self-respect did not need validation. And as this quieter way of living settled in, she began to notice how the world responded when she stopped explaining herself and simply stood by her decisions. That response would teach her something deeper, something she hadn't expected. When she stopped explaining herself, she didn't expect the world to react, but it did, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. At first, the reactions were subtle. A pause after her answers, a slightly longer silence than usual, a look that suggested curiosity rather than confrontation. She noticed them all, not because she was anxious, but because she was finally paying attention. People had grown used to her explanations. They had relied on them. Her reasons had made things predictable, comfortable. Now, predictability was gone. When she said no without justification, some people waited. As if more words were coming, they didn't. That absence unsettled them, not because her decision was unreasonable, but because they no longer had a place to stand inside it. She realized something important. Explanations had never been about clarity alone. They had been invitations, invitations for others to enter her decisions, to comment, to negotiate. Without explanations, those invitations disappeared. Some people respected that immediately. They adjusted their expectations. They accepted her boundaries without resistance. Those interactions felt clean, balanced. Others struggled. They asked questions disguised as concern. Are you okay? Is something wrong? You seem different lately. She didn't correct them. Difference does not always require reassurance. Earlier, she would have rushed to soften the moment, to clarify, to make sure no one felt uneasy. Now, she allowed the discomfort to exist. Discomfort, she was learning, is not harmful. Avoiding it is. There were moments when she felt the old reflex rise, the urge to explain, to justify, to smooth things over. She noticed the urge and let it pass. Resisting old habits is not loud, it is quiet discipline. She also noticed how her relationships began to reorganize themselves, without effort, without confrontation. Some conversations grew shorter, not colder, simpler. She stopped filling silences. Silence no longer felt like a gap that needed repair. It felt like space. Space changed the quality of her interactions. People who valued control became impatient. They wanted reasons. They wanted access. She offered neither. People who valued respect stayed. They didn't need explanations to remain present. This distinction was not painful. It was clarifying. She wasn't losing people. She was seeing them clearly. At work, the change showed itself differently. She stopped over-explaining her decisions. She stated them. At first, she worried she might be misunderstood, but something unexpected happened. She was taken more seriously. Certainty, she learned, does not need decoration. When she spoke less, her words carried more weight. She noticed how often she had used explanations to seek approval. Approval she no longer needed. This shift didn't make her rigid. It made her grounded. She still listened. She still considered feedback, but she no longer defended her choices by default. Defensiveness had drained her. Groundedness restored her. In friendships, the changes were even clearer. She declined invitations without guilt. She chose quiet evenings over social obligations. She didn't frame her choices as temporary. They were simply hers. Some friends adjusted easily, others drifted. Drifting was not dramatic. It was gradual. She felt moments of sadness, not regret. Sadness for versions of herself that had worked so hard to be understood, but she did not return to those habits. Growth often requires staying with discomfort. There were also moments of relief she hadn't expected. She realized how much time she had spent managing reactions, how many hours of her life had been devoted to anticipation. Now that time was hers again. She used it quietly. Reading, walking, thinking, she began to feel present in ways she hadn't in years. One afternoon, she noticed how calm her body felt during a conversation that would once have unsettled her. She had said no, the other person had paused. The moment passed, her heart did not race, her thoughts did not scramble. Peace, she realized, is often the absence of self-betrayal. She had not announced this change to anyone. She didn't need to. Consistency communicates more than explanation ever could. As weeks passed, her sense of self became less reactive. She stopped preparing responses in advance, stopped rehearsing defenses. She trusted herself to respond honestly in the moment. Trust is built quietly. Not everyone approved of her new way of being, but approval no longer guided her decisions. She learned to differentiate between curiosity and entitlement, between care and control. That discernment sharpened her awareness. Some people tried to provoke explanations. They framed questions as concern. She responded with calm brevity. Brevity, she learned, is not avoidance, it is clarity. She was not closing herself off. She was choosing what deserved access. As she moved through her days, she felt something settle inside her, not confidence. Stability does not seek validation, it sustains itself. She began to understand why this change had taken so long. She had been taught that being good meant being accommodating, that being kind meant being available. But kindness without boundaries becomes self-erasure. She was no longer erasing herself. This did not make her harder, it made her honest. Her honesty changed the tone of her life. She noticed how her decisions aligned more closely with her values, how little explanation they required. Life felt quieter, not smaller, and in that quiet she discovered something unexpected. The people who truly saw her did not ask for explanations. They listened, they stayed. That realization gave her strength, not loud strength, quiet endurance. She didn't explain herself anymore. And in that absence of explanation, her life began to speak for itself. What she did not yet know was how deeply this change would affect the way she handled future challenges, because explaining had once been her shield. And now, without it, she would learn something even more powerful. Life has a way of testing change, not immediately, not when it's new and fragile, but later when it has settled just enough to feel real. The challenge didn't arrive as conflict, it arrived as responsibility. Something shifted in her daily life, not suddenly, but enough to demand decisions that could not be postponed. There were expectations again, from work, from family, from people who had always assumed access to her time. This time the pressure felt familiar, but her response did not. Earlier she would have prepared herself, not for the decision but for the explanation that would follow. Now she prepared only for the decision. One request arrived that required her to say no, not a casual no, a significant one. Saying yes would have been easier, more acceptable, less disruptive, but yes would have cost her something she was no longer willing to trade. She felt the weight of the moment, not fear, awareness that this was not about convenience, it was about alignment. She chose no. The silence that followed was heavier than before. This time people questioned her. Directly, they asked why. The old reflex surfaced instantly. Explain, clarify, soften. She felt it rise in her chest, and then she paused. The pause was brief but deliberate. She realized something in that moment. If she explained now, she would not be choosing peace. She would be choosing comfort, comfort for others. She held her ground. She repeated her decision, no additional words. The room changed, not dramatically, subtly. Some people looked uncomfortable, some confused, some disappointed. No one was angry. Anger had never been the real threat. Discomfort was. She stayed present. Her body remained calm, her voice steady. She noticed how different this felt from past moments. Earlier, she would have felt guilt. She would have felt responsible for the reaction in the room. Now she felt something else. Integrity. Integrity is quiet. It does not argue, it stands. The conversation moved on, not smoothly, but it moved. Later that evening, she reflected on the moment, not with doubt, with clarity. She had not been misunderstood, she had been challenged. There is a difference. Being misunderstood requires correction. Being challenged requires resolve. She realized how often she had mistaken one for the other. That night, sleep came easily, not because the decision was easy, but because it was honest. The following days brought more reactions, some indirect. Some subtle. A few people pulled back slightly, not out of anger, out of adjustment. She let them. Adjustment is part of change. She did not chase reassurance. She did not revisit the conversation. She trusted that what needed explanation would reveal itself through time. At work, the decision changed how she was perceived. Some colleagues hesitated. Others respected her clarity. She noticed that boundaries create definition. Definition invites respect. In her personal life, the shift was quieter but deeper. She found herself saying no more often, not impulsively, intentionally. She chose rest without apology. She chose solitude without justification. Solitude no longer felt like absence, it felt like space. There were moments of loneliness. She did not deny them. Loneliness is not a failure, it is information. It tells you where you have relied on external validation. She listened. As days passed, she noticed how much emotional energy she had been conserving. She was no longer negotiating her own needs. That negotiation had once felt necessary. Now it felt unnecessary. She began to trust her internal signals. Fatigue meant rest, discomfort meant pause, clarity meant action. She no longer filtered those signals through other people's expectations. That autonomy changed how she moved through the world. She walked slower, listened more deeply, responded less urgently. Urgency had once been her default. Now it felt intrusive. She noticed how many decisions in her past had been shaped by timing rather than truth. Truth requires patience. Patience was something she was finally allowing herself. One conversation stood out. Someone asked her if she had changed. She considered the question, then answered honestly. She had not changed, she had stopped compensating. That distinction mattered. Compensation had masked her natural pace. Without it, her life felt truer. She didn't feel the need to convince anyone of that. Her choices were no longer performances, they were reflections. Reflection requires stillness. Stillness was becoming her strength. She noticed how challenges felt different now. They did not threaten her sense of self. They tested her alignment. Alignment held. There were moments when she questioned herself. Not because she doubted her decision, but because growth often brings unfamiliar silence. She learned to sit with that silence. Silence was no longer empty, it was spacious. She realized something essential. Explaining had once protected her from judgment. Now, not explaining protected her from self-betrayal. Self-betrayal had been subtle, frequent, invisible. Without explanations, she could no longer hide from herself. That honesty was demanding, but freeing. She did not feel superior. She felt grounded. Grounded people do not seek approval, they seek alignment. As weeks passed, she saw how this change shaped her future decisions. She planned less. She trusted more. Trusting herself did not eliminate uncertainty. It reduced fear. Fear thrives on over-explanation. Clarity dissolves it. She didn't explain herself anymore, and life slowly began to meet her where she stood. The next phase would test her in a different way, not through pressure from others, but through vulnerability. Because standing firm is one thing, staying open is another, and she would soon learn how not explaining herself would redefine intimacy, trust, and the way she allowed others into her world. Not explaining herself had given her strength, but strength, she was learning, was only one part of living honestly. The other part was vulnerability. Vulnerability arrived quietly, not as weakness, as openness. She had built boundaries that protected her time and energy. They were solid, clear, but boundaries alone do not create connection, they create safety, and safety invites something deeper. She began to notice moments where silence was not enough, moments where presence required more than standing firm. Someone close to her needed reassurance, not explanations, reassurance. This was unfamiliar territory. Earlier in her life, reassurance and explanation had been the same thing. Now she understood the difference. Explanation defends a choice, reassurance acknowledges a feeling. She could offer reassurance without justifying herself. That realization softened something inside her. She began to speak when it mattered, not to convince, but to connect. She shared selectively, carefully. Not every part of her life required access, but some moments deserved openness. This balance felt delicate. Too much silence could create distance. Too many words could invite control. She learned to sense the difference. In conversations that mattered, she stayed present. She listened fully. She responded honestly. Honesty did not mean detail, it meant truth. Truth sometimes sounded like, I don't have the words yet. I need time. This matters to me. She noticed how differently these words landed. They did not invite debate. They invited understanding. Understanding is not automatic. It requires patience from both sides. She allowed relationships to slow down. Slowness revealed intention. People who valued her presence adjusted their pace. People who needed constant access became impatient. Impatience clarified things. She did not label anyone wrong. She observed. Observation became her new guide. In one relationship, the shift was especially noticeable. The other person wanted closeness, but closeness to them meant access without limits. She did not explain her boundaries again, she stated them, but this time she added something else. Context, not justification, context. Context sounds like honesty without defense. She shared how much quiet mattered to her, how rest was not withdrawal, how space allowed her to remain present. She did not apologize for this truth. The response was slow, but thoughtful. That moment taught her something important. Vulnerability does not weaken boundaries, it humanizes them. Humanized boundaries are easier to respect. She began to trust that sharing selectively did not undo her progress, it deepened it. She no longer feared being misunderstood. She accepted that misunderstanding is part of being known. The difference was choice. She chose when to clarify, she chose when to stay silent. Choice returned agency to her voice. She noticed how intimacy changed. It became quieter, slower, less about constant contact, more about mutual presence. She stopped performing availability. She offered authenticity. Authenticity does not require explanation. It requires courage, courage to remain steady when others seek reassurance through control. She noticed moments when vulnerability felt risky, when sharing her inner world could invite pressure. In those moments, she chose restraint. Restraint is not fear, it is discernment. She learned that openness without discernment leads back to exhaustion. Her discernment sharpened over time. She felt safer in her own presence. That safety allowed her to listen more deeply to others. And to herself, she noticed her emotional responses more clearly. She didn't rush to resolve them, she allowed them space. Emotions, she learned, do not need explanations either. They need acknowledgement. She acknowledged hers quietly. This inner steadiness changed how she showed up. She was less reactive, more responsive. Responsiveness created room for genuine connection. People felt it. Some relationships deepened. They grew slower but stronger. Others remained at a distance. That distance felt respectful. She no longer measured closeness by frequency. She measured it by quality. Quality thrives on presence. Presence does not rush. As she navigated vulnerability with boundaries, she noticed something subtle but powerful. Her need to be seen diminished, not because she felt invisible, but because she felt grounded. Grounded people do not chase understanding. They invite it. She invited understanding through consistency. Consistency revealed her values more clearly than words ever could. She was learning that intimacy does not require access to everything. It requires respect for what is shared. That understanding brought peace. She did not fear closeness anymore. She trusted herself to remain intact within it. This trust marked a turning point, because soon life would ask her to open herself in a new way, not through conversation, but through uncertainty. And how she navigated that uncertainty without explaining herself would determine the final shape of her journey. She was ready, not because she knew what would happen, but because she trusted how she would respond. In time, the quiet became familiar. Not empty, not distant, familiar. She no longer noticed the absence of explanations, because her life had reorganized itself around something else. Clarity. Clarity did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust after movement stops. Her days felt different now. Not lighter because they were easier, but lighter because they were honest. She woke without rehearsing conversations. She moved through decisions without anticipating reactions. Anticipation had once shaped her choices. Now intention did. She began to notice how her body responded to this shift. Less tension in her shoulders, fewer restless nights. A steadier breath during conversations. Peace was no longer something she searched for, it was something she protected. Protection did not look dramatic, it looked like consistency. She chose how much energy to give. She chose when to speak. She chose when silence was enough. These choices accumulated. Over time, people adjusted fully. Some forgot that she had ever explained herself so much. Others remembered and respected the difference. She did not correct their memories. The past no longer needed clarification. Her relationships settled into their natural shapes. The ones built on mutual respect grew quieter but deeper. The ones built on access dissolved gently. Nothing collapsed. Nothing needed saving. She understood then that not every ending requires closure. Some things simply stop asking for your attention. She had once feared that not explaining herself would isolate her. It didn't, it refined her world. She spent more time with herself, not in isolation, in alignment. Alignment changed how she experienced solitude. Solitude became nourishing. She walked more, not to escape, to arrive in her body, in her thoughts, in her pace. She noticed details she had overlooked for years. The way light changed throughout the day, the comfort of routine, the relief of not rushing. Rushing, she realized, had always been fueled by fear, fear of falling behind. Fear of disappointing others. Without explanations, those fears lost momentum. She no longer tried to be ahead of herself. She met herself where she was. There were moments of doubt, not regret, doubt. Doubt asked quietly, "Is this enough?" She listened and answered honestly, yes. Enough was no longer defined by productivity or approval. Enough was defined by presence. Presence felt complete. She noticed how younger versions of herself had believed that being good meant being agreeable. She felt compassion for that version. That version had done her best with what she knew. Growth did not require rejecting the past, it required releasing it. She released the belief that she owed everyone understanding. She released the need to be palatable. Palatability had once kept her safe. Now it felt unnecessary. Safety came from within. She trusted herself to navigate misunderstanding. She trusted herself to handle discomfort. That trust was earned. Life continued to present choices. Some small, some significant. She approached all of them the same way. She listened inwardly first. Her decisions did not come from urgency. They came from alignment. Alignment removed drama. She stopped labeling choices as right or wrong. She labeled them true or untrue. Truth simplified everything. In conversations, she noticed how much quieter she had become, not withdrawn, intentional. When she spoke, it was because she wanted to connect, not to persuade. Persuasion no longer interested her. She had learned that understanding cannot be forced. It emerges when space is allowed. Space was something she now respected deeply. She respected it in herself. She respected it in others. This mutual respect changed the texture of her life. Time slowed, not because she did less, because she did what mattered. She felt less fragmented, less pulled. Her inner life felt whole. There were moments when others misunderstood her silence. She let that be. She no longer felt responsible for every interpretation. Interpretation belongs to the listener. She belonged to herself. One evening, she reflected on how far she had come, not with pride, with gratitude. Gratitude for the moment she first paused instead of explaining. Gratitude for the discomfort she endured without retreating. Gratitude for the courage it took to stay quiet when she wanted to justify herself. That courage had changed her life. She realized something quietly profound. Explaining herself had once been her way of staying connected. Now staying connected meant staying true. Truth does not raise its voice, it stands. She stood, not rigid, rooted. Her life was not perfect, it was real. Real did not require defense. As she looked ahead, she felt prepared. Not for specific outcomes, for presence. Presence would guide her, as it always had once she stopped talking over it. She didn't explain herself anymore, and in doing so, she finally heard her own voice clearly. That voice did not rush. It did not apologize, it did not seek permission. It simply said, "This is who I am, this is how I live," and that was enough.